Ronald McNair is the black astronaut. He's a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T and a presidential scholar. He's one of America's first 4 black astronauts.
Try to keep us informed of where you are in the timeline also.
I've been in the cockpit of one of the space shuttles. What you do is crawl down into it from on top. It's relatively confined, but once they get up there again, as I indicate to you, they can move around a little bit, although for a 5 or 6 day period, it's close quarters.
Okay.
That is Krista McAuliffe, who's in the foreground here. And I think Gregory Jarvis, who is seated beside her.
It's got that little drawstring on it, so you can tie it off.
Would you like one?
I need. Do you have an extra?
Yes, I do.
Oh.
Teachers are always prepared.
Thank you.
On liftoff, other astronauts have told me before that it's an exciting sensation because there's an awful lot of thrust that is developed, more than 2 million pounds on either side of you with those solid rocket boosters, but it's nothing that the human body can't withstand, even those bodies that are untrained, in effect, to the extreme force of G's. There you can see how close the quarters are. And that's where they were strapped in today, still in place, when the explosion occurred, that it appears to all who have looked at it, killed them all. Mr. McNair, 2 children, and a wife, Cheryl.
Is all of Hugh's operation in El Segundo?
No, you can request an MS transfer bag, which is like a pouch, a mailman's type bag. Hell, I don't know how strong those lockers are. I wouldn't trust my weight on it.
Get me up there, then I'll have to.
Communication system in kind of one.
We just received word that President Reagan will make his address live to the nation tonight at 5 p.m. That's in 1 hour from now, Eastern Standard Time.
I had a terrible set of events. I lived in Boston for 2 years and then went to.
And you just start putting all your stuff on, and then we'll get the whole orbiter configured, and we'll give them each their bags, and then you know, while they're getting the flight deck ready to go home, and then all of us will, the 3 of us.
This is Ellison Onizuka, who is a 39-year-old mission specialist as well. He has 2 children that he leaves behind, we believe. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and winner of the Air Force Commendation Medal. Air Force test pilots, of course, are in a high-risk occupation. Nonetheless, no one ever expects this kind of thing to happen. There are generally 2 categories of astronauts, those who entered from the scientific field and those who entered from the Air Force or from the piloting side. Judy Resnick is an example of someone who came in, an electrical engineer. She was intrigued by the electrical challenges that were involved. Some of them also, of course, become both scientists and pilots. In the case of Sally Ride, she became interested in aviation generally. We want to remind our NBC stations along the way that we're going to take a station break now, that NBC News will have continuous coverage of this tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger today, but that those of you who want to return to local programming can do so at this time. Dan Molina now is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Dan?
Tom, we, like everyone else at this point, are waiting for Jess Moore, the Associate Administrator of NASA, who is responsible for the Space Shuttle program, to address us all at a news conference to be held at the Kennedy Space Center. They will, of course, try to tell us what they know at this point. Whatever they know, they are getting from the telemetry data, which was coming down all the time. During the launch of the Space Shuttle, there's a constant flow of data to the Mission Control Center here at the Johnson Space Center. That, of course, has been analyzed over the last couple of hours to see what they can possibly learn from that. It's not at all certain, as we were saying earlier, that they will ever be able to determine exactly what went wrong, but there is, again, the possibility that the telemetry will show them something. Then there are the incidental factors, the things that could have gone wrong that nobody expected. We were talking about the weather this morning, the ice. There was no indication from NASA this morning that they were ever concerned that the ice would do anything more than pose a threat to the heat protection tiles. They worry that if a shuttle takes off when it's icy cold and there's icicles on it, that one of those icicles might puncture or otherwise damage one of the heat protection tiles, and that would result in some sort of a hazard to re-entry. I was very taken with Jay Barbary's comment earlier on when he said, what about if one of those chunks of ice was to hit one of the lines that runs between the external tank and the orbiter itself? That does, of course, pose the possibility of rupturing one of those lines. The possibilities at this point are endless. We were saying earlier that I have spoken with Max Faget, the designer of the space shuttle, widely regarded as the father of the space shuttle. He was completely in the dark. He, of course, is watching as close as he can. Dr. Faget is retired from NASA, but he was watching from his office, and he said he has complained several times about any number of things that were involved in the design, but he said at this point there was nothing that we ever predicted could be that serious, that could result in a catastrophic failure. It's one of those things that you write off to possibility, but you can't speculate at this point how it could have happened. We have here a model of the space shuttle. For those of you who may not have seen it earlier, it's well at this point probably to review the major components of it. This is the large external tank, and as Tom has pointed out, this external tank contains fuel that amounts to making the shuttle a flying bomb when it goes up into space. On the outside are solid rocket boosters. Now, each of these solid rocket boosters develops a thrust of something like 2.9 million pounds. They separate from the shuttle as it gets to a certain point in the flight. At the point where the catastrophic explosion occurred this morning, they were about halfway to the point where these solid rocket boosters would normally have come off the side of the shuttle and then been picked up at sea, and that is the normal procedure. The external tank goes up with the shuttle further on into space and disintegrates as it comes back down through the atmosphere. We were a little over a minute into the flight. We were at the point where they were approaching what's called max Q. That's the point of maximum dynamic pressure on the orbiter itself, created by the combination of the main engine thrust, 3 main engines down here. Each of them developed something like 375,000 pounds of thrust. That thrust is added to by the 2.9 million pounds that comes from each of the solid rocket boosters. We were approaching the point, as I say, where all of that creates the maximum pressure that is going to occur on the vehicle at any point. The order was given, you go to throttle up, to Dick Scobie, the mission commander, and at that point, the explosion occurred. Now, Tom, I must say I was very, very taken by your reflections on Judy Resnick, and I got a chance to be around her a little bit, and I knew her to be the extraordinary person that you describe her to be. In addition to everything else, she was a concert pianist. Krista McCullough was somebody who I had a chance to be around at some length, and I could tell in being around her why they chose her. NASA was looking, when they selected their teacher, they were looking for somebody who would communicate that enthusiasm, who would be the kind of communicator. They were looking for a PR person to some degree, but they were also looking for somebody to generate the excitement of the fact that, yes, we are crossing over to a new age in space, and the space shuttle is the cutting edge of all of that technology. Our culture is changing to accommodate these changes in technology, and Krista McCullough was somebody who NASA chose to make that point to her students, to all students, and to the American people. She had that quality about her. She had that quality of enthusiasm, plus she had the can-do quality of an astronaut. She never got sick. They took her up several times in what they refer to as the vomit comet, for example. That's that KC-135 aircraft that goes up and does these loops in the sky that are designed to make you sick. They're designed to create that feeling of total, well, it creates weightlessness, but it's also designed to put the astronauts in a situation where they feel that sense of utter helplessness. They're floating around in space, and they often get sick. 50% of them, half of them who have gone up in space have gotten sick. Krista McCullough, through all of the training that she went through all of her rides on the Vomit Comet, never got sick. She had a hardiness to her and enthusiasm that showed all the way through all of her training. And she spoke very, very well about the way she was accepted into the program because of those qualities. She didn't try to impose herself. She didn't try to become a star, as she well could have done. And because of that, the astronauts viewed her as one of their own. Even though some of them had some misgivings about the Citizen in Space program, as you heard Deke Slayton say earlier, and Dick Scobie has said several times, that anybody who is going to go into space, any citizen participant, whether it's a teacher or the journalist that they were planning to take up, that person would have to have a reason for being there. They would have to have some good purpose, some return to the nation and to NASA for being up in space. I'm hearing something now coming over our NASA Select circuit.
You can keep them on until we get into question and answer.
I'm hearing the preparations now for the news conference at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
All right.
Tom, it looks like that's coming on us imminently here.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. Dan Molina, who has been following the space program for some time now for NBC News, from Houston and the Johnson Space Program. Across the country, of course, we're all bound together by our common feelings of this national tragedy. This is at Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, the flag already at half-staff. And the reaction of some people from around New York City.
Solid booster rocket, that right at this point there could have been a tearing when the rocket went into great acceleration, its fastest point. But of course that alluded to this a few minutes ago when they went to a full power at about 1.
Well, the only thing I could think about with those kids in that auditorium and the trauma they must be going, and what a shock it must be for them to watch something like that happen to their teacher. That's what I was thinking of.
I think maybe they are doing a little too many shuttles, so I wasn't really that shocked. If you keep going up and going up, there's more reason for error, more room for error. A shock is it just reminded me of a disaster of previous times, of how the community would react, like the Hindenburg when that went up, and the human tragedy, the loss of life.
I think what bothers you about this is that this represents the epitome of the technology that our country has, and everything that we've ever put into space technology manifests itself in the shuttle program. And for something like this to go wrong, what do? You start from scratch again.
Whenever you hear about something like this, you always have some kind of shock, because it's out of the ordinary, and you don't expect things like this to happen.
Once again, Kennedy Space Center, the flag at half-staff today. Of course, more people are killed in regular airplane accidents or in tornadoes, sometimes even in car accidents. And while we're moved by those tragedies as well, we're bound together by this one because we all seem to be attached to the space program in one fashion or another. We have an emotional and a political and even a financial stake in it. And we have such an attachment to the astronauts, and especially to Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher who was representing all the school teachers in the country. And in her own way, she was representing the vicarious thrills for the rest of us, too, by going up there. She was a risk taker with the regular astronauts in hopes that she could advance her knowledge about what goes on in outer space and then share that knowledge with the new generation of young students. Jake Garn, a senator from Utah, recently completed successfully a space shuttle orbital flight of about 1 week, as I recall, together. He talked about it today with great feeling in the Senate gallery about his friends.
To what happened today?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system, and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, what was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter, yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Gramm-Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on, and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator Jake Garn, Republican of Utah, who flew successfully in a space shuttle, and as you heard him say today, he had friends on board this crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew up in space 1 minute and 15 seconds after launch, approximately, about 5 miles up. Apparently they were all killed. As for the NASA investigation, NBC News Chief White House correspondent Chris Wallace has just told me over the telephone that he is hearing at the White House that NASA will appoint a high official of that agency who is not connected with the space shuttle program to head the investigation. Now, NASA, of course, has a number of responsibilities, so there will be a high official of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration who will be heading up this investigation. We have been awaiting an official word from NASA on what happened today and the ultimate fate, of course, of the 7-person astronaut crew. We just now have been informed that that probably will not occur for another 6 minutes or so. They are gathered at the Kennedy Space Center and also at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Vice President Bush and a congressional delegation that includes Senator John Glenn and Senator Garn, whom we just heard on videotape, headed for the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where they will be the president's official representatives. The president himself is expected to address the nation, at last we heard, at 5 p.m. today, Eastern Time. That would be in about 41 minutes from now. So apparently he'll come up right after we hear from NASA officials at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm sure that this is all being carefully coordinated. That is, that the White House is on the telephone with NASA officials both in Washington, Houston, and in Florida, finding out just what went wrong, and they'll be sharing that with us as soon as they can. The NASA officials will be. It really is one of the remarkable features of the American space program, as opposed to, say, what goes on in the Soviet Union, that through good times and bad, NASA does talk to the people through the American press. That you'll remember in the early days of the Space Shuttle program, there were some embarrassing moments when we were all there with the cameras trained on the launch pad, and yet there was a computer glitch in the final seconds, and so we had to wait for another full 24 hours and then another 24 hours after that. We saw earlier those tragic pictures of Chaffee, Grissom, and White when they were killed 19 years ago on the launch pad in a fire in a Mercury capsule atop a Saturn rocket as they were preparing for the Apollo space program. So NASA, along the way, has been a very open agency, sometimes very painfully. And we are now told that it will be another 10 minutes before we hear from NASA today at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That could slip even more for all we know. Let us show you once again, as we have so often today, just what happened. And if I may, I'm just going to borrow this, this model. And it may seem redundant to those of you who have been watching all afternoon long, but there are a number of people who are joining us along the way, so we're going to repeat what we know as best we know it throughout the day here. This, of course, is the Space Shuttle as it is set up. This is the vehicle itself. The Challenger was set up just like that on the space pad in Florida today, and it launched in that configuration. If we open it up, you'll remember seeing the great bay there. How does it get into space? Well, it gets into space because it is propelled by all of this, really. There are 2 solid rockets on either side. They develop 1 million pounds of thrust on takeoff, and then they're jettisoned. That is, they peel away and they are parachuted to Earth and they're recovered in the ocean so they can be used again. This, however, is in effect a kind of bomb. It's a Roman candle taking off, if you will, with a lot of extraneous power. In here, more than 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. And that fuels at extremely cold temperatures the main engines, which are located here at the bottom of the vehicle, through some ducts that are located down there. Now, there was some ice that had formed there earlier today. Whether that had anything to do with the problem or not, we don't know. We now want to show you slow motion of what happened today, 1 minute and 15 seconds after takeoff, at about 3 times the speed of sound, There's the shuttle on the bottom. And then, as you can see, a fireball races through the length of the external tank, and there's this enormous explosion. And debris begins to rain down through the Florida skies, peeling off to the right one of the solid rockets. So the indication is that the explosion was not in that rocket, at least. And that's what happened. And as we indicated to you a few moments ago, we expect in about 10 minutes or so to have from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I have to get this out of the way because we have a guest coming up here dealing with science policy. Tell me who you are.
I'm John Logston. I'm the director of the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in Washington. Spent 20 years of a career tracing the history and development of the U.S. civilian space program.
There's been an awful lot of speculation so far today, Mr. Logston, as you know, about what happens now to the American space program. This, quite plainly, is a very serious setback. Is it your guess that there will be a major reevaluation, not of the effort to go into space, because that will go forward? I mean, science will go on at this point.
It must.
It must indeed, because that's part of the risk, that how we learn, after all. But what about the shuttle program and whether or not we should have a more broadly based program rather than, as I have been saying here this afternoon, all of our eggs in this one basket?
Well, one big difference between the last accident 19 years ago and this time is that we've got 24 successes before this tragedy. We know the shuttle system works and works well. Fragile and obviously risky. Every time it goes off, it's risky. We now have 3 in the spare parts for 1 more if we choose to put it together. But we clearly need a broader base for access to space. To depend on one system for everything we want to do is probably not good planning.
So we don't have to scrap the shuttle program altogether, but what we ought to be doing is looking at whether or not we want to concentrate on the shuttle program or spread it out a little bit so that we have some rockets that don't have to have manpower required to go up with them.
That's right. There are plenty of things that we've been doing with the shuttle that we could do with expendable launch vehicles. Really, the shuttle ought to be used for what it and it alone can do, and it gives us remarkable capabilities in those areas.
Has the shuttle been worth it so far?
Yes.
Setting apart this tragedy, of course.
Setting apart, but it has opened up living, working, finding out what human capabilities are in space in a way that cannot be done.
And yet we're well behind the curve that NASA originally set out in terms of expectations about how it could be paid for and how many launches that they could have.
Oh, indeed. But part of that is not NASA's fault. It's a public decision not to spend the money, make the investment at the pace that could have resulted in a much faster program. Part of it is the kind of optimists that people that want to go in space are, that always look at the high end of expectations.
So, Logston, what is this going to do to the President's Star Wars program or the Strategic Defense Initiative?
I don't think it has anything to do with it, except the shuttle was a test bed for a lot of those experiments. It does show, it seems to me, how risky, how uncertain doing things in space still is, to have a whole defense system based on technology that has to work.
And politically, that will open some fresh territory, won't it, for the President's critics?
I believe so.
Mr. Logston, as you look at the space program and the American attitudes toward about it, have we become too blasé about high technology and the leading edge of technology, about what it can do and the risks that are involved?
Well, I think that the shuttle was supposed to be routine, and we were beginning to treat it as routine. What was special about this mission was Krista McAuliffe. Otherwise, it would have been just another mission. The other 6 people are not public personalities, equally as adventurous and taking as many risks. The public was excited this weekend as we got the images back from Uranus. The program continues to both do routine, useful things and break out into the future.
Mr. Logston, thanks very much for coming by.
Right.
From George Washington University.
That's correct.
Lifetime of study, effectively, all of your adult life, of science policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are awaiting now in about 3 minutes, as I say, the news conference. And before we go to Steve Delaney, what we want to do is show you briefly a piece of videotape that we have here in Washington. Congressman Bill Nelson, who made a ride in the last shuttle that went up successfully. And he talked about whether or not these astronauts who were involved in today's explosion had any chance at all. Congressman Bill Nelson.
Even if there had been ejection seats, from my knowledge of the system and observing today what happened, there would not have been any opportunity for escape by ejecting, given the flame that consumed after the initial explosion. In my personal knowledge, would I know if anybody would have, on that crew, had a chance to know that something was wrong? And the answer to that is no.
If there's anything, I suppose, that we can be grateful for, it appears to us, at least, from the naked eye, from this distance, that any deaths that may have occurred, that appear to have occurred, all those deaths were instantaneous. It was an explosion of great magnitude. As I indicated to you a few moments ago, Roy Neal was told by scientists that that was an explosion the equivalent of a small nuclear charge. To put it quite bluntly, it does appear that those astronauts and Krista McAuliffe simply didn't know what hit them. That the explosion happened instantaneously. And of course, as you saw, there were lots of pieces of debris that rained down into the Atlantic Ocean. At the Kennedy Space Center now at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Steve Delaney, who has been there all day long witnessing what for him was a thrilling moment, the liftoff of the space shuttle. And it is, for those of you who have not seen it, when you see it in person, there's nothing quite like it. And then had that thrill turn into a horror of watching the space shuttle come apart in the skies. What's the latest from there, Steve, in terms of what the NASA scientists are going to tell us and when?
I wish I could preview it. We just don't know, Tom. They've been sliding this back about 5 minutes at a time for quite a while now. Jess Moore is going to conduct the briefing. Apparently, he's going to do it himself. Jess Moore has been running the manned space program. NASA is a little bit understaffed at the top right now because James Beggs, the administrator, is kind of on a leave of absence while he handles some legal problems. Jess Moore has been running it as the associate director for manned spaceflight, which means he's in charge of those who are associated with the shuttle program. And earlier, before any of this took place, he was the one who was conducting the briefings to say that, well, there was a problem with the weather here or there, or in the case of the delay that rolled the thing over until through the weekend, there was a problem with a mechanical device, a door handle of all things, that they couldn't quite pull out because it has to be replaced before they can lift off. And Jess Moore was the one who was in charge. He's in transit. He's on his way to assume administration of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and from now on that'll be his post, and there'll be another person assigned here to take care of the manned spaceflight program. But he will conduct the briefing, and I'd like to be able to suspect that the reason they've been putting it back is perhaps they are trying to collate and gather together little bits and pieces of information which would allow him to give us as definitive a look as we've had yet as to, if not why it happened, certainly what happened. And the briefing is about to begin, and the speaker is Hugh Harris, the spokesman.
Steve Delaney?
Yes, Tom.
All right, here we are now.
As I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area, approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as you know?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
This is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
Okay, here. I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Carroll from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge. And we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our number one priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker. Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, We only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all. Thank you.
That's the news conference from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where we heard Jess Moore with the first definitive, although not wide-ranging, reaction of NASA to what happened today at about 1 minute and 30 seconds, as he indicated, after liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It blew up. He would not speculate at all on what may have happened. He would not even say whether he believed that the shuttle itself, that is the aircraft, the space aircraft, was consumed in the explosion or whether it went down intact. And then we believe if it did that, in fact, it would have broken up when it hit the water. He would not even comment on that. He did say that all tapes, all notes, all reactions now have been impounded. There will be a full investigation. And he says, I regret, I have to report that there is no evidence that any member of the crew survived this explosion. And as we have been looking at this gigantic fireball all day long, there is no indication that anyone could have survived that no ejection system could have permitted any kind of an escape to safety on the part of the 7 people on board, including Krista McAuliffe. Here once again is the stop action. That is the shuttle itself on the bottom part, as you can see. The solid rocket booster is the white one atop that, and then the big external tank seems to just come apart, as you can see. And as the fire races through it, it triggers this enormous explosion. It's the dark area between the 2 white areas that we're looking at. That's the external tank, although it's not well defined in this picture. This is it in slow motion. You see where that begins to break up there? While the solid rocket booster itself continues to go, and then we saw it break away. Now, there's another one on the other side, of course, but it does appear that it's the solid rocket booster, and that flame, as you can see, consumes the space shuttle in which 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, of Concord, New Hampshire, tragically watched by her husband and her 2 children today, as well as by her parents. And they could barely believe their eyes as they watched that unfold in the bright blue skies over Florida. It was a tragic end to what everyone had hoped would be a triumphant flight for this young school teacher and her 6 associates, who were all veteran members of the astronaut program. To bring you up to date, in about 9 minutes, we expect to hear from President Reagan speaking directly to the nation from the Oval Office. All other official business today in this nation's capital, as you might expect, has been set aside. The president was scheduled to address the joint session of Congress tonight, a brief thematic speech of what he hoped for the next year. That now has been postponed at least a week until next Tuesday night is the current schedule. The president will speak to us at 5 o'clock in 9 minutes Eastern time from the White House tonight. And then we'll have a brief pause after that, and we'll go on with our business of covering this story. The president received word of this tragedy while he was preparing for a briefing today in the Oval Office. It was delivered to him by Vice President Bush and Admiral Poindexter, who is the Chief of National Security Affairs for the White House. The president then watched a television replay. It was, of course, the idea of his administration to put a teacher in space in an effort to engage this generation in space exploration and what can be learned from it. Krista McAuliffe was chosen in a nationwide competition, then selected from 10 finalists. Mrs. Reagan was watching in the private quarters upstairs live when the explosion occurred. Her reaction was to say, "Oh my God," and then to pray, hope against hope, that somebody could survive. Robert Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Bob, based on what Jess Moore had to say so far, apart from the fact that we know that there will be a procedure involved in the investigation and that all future flights are, for the moment at least, frozen, we didn't learn a great deal, but that's understandable, isn't it?
It is understandable because obviously they don't know a great deal yet. However, there was one point that might give us a clue to what's going to happen in the next few days and weeks and months, which was a question that he didn't really answer that came from William Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times, which is to do with whether there is a news blackout here. And it could be interpreted either way, but it sounds like NASA doesn't want to have a whole lot to say for a long time, and so it may be a while before we know what goes on. The NASA under the Reagan administration has taken a slightly different attitude about how it relates to the press. It certainly has been open. It certainly is showing us everything, but they haven't been as eager to share everything with the press as they were under previous administrations. It'll be very interesting to see how they respond now when they're under a great deal of pressure, when there'll be a great demand to get leaks to try to find out what's going on. But right now it looks like they're clamping down everything. They want to, as he said, to impound everything, including the notes that the engineers, technicians made on the pad to try to find out. So it doesn't look like we're going to find anything out for a long time. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where, as I indicated earlier, he was out there for some developments in the Voyager space program. That's the unmanned space probe, of course, that just sent back those extraordinary pictures of the moons of Uranus. So it has been a 3 or 4 day period of the trials and triumphs of space, the tragedies and the triumphs, really, because there was so much to be learned from those pictures as well. And we had all hoped that we would learn something from this space shuttle. To hear from Krista McAuliffe, a gifted young teacher filled with enthusiasm and energy. Tragically, her children, Scott 9 and Caroline 6, were there today when it all blew up. And in Concord, New Hampshire, a school auditorium filled with students watching first with unrestrained joy and then in disbelief as they saw those television pictures of the contrails spewing off debris into the Atlantic Ocean today as well. We want to talk to you just for a few moments, if we can, about these people who are all involved, not only Krista McAuliffe, but the other 6 regular members of the astronaut crew as well. We don't want to lose sight of who they were. This is Francis Richard Scobie. He was the 46-year-old commander, a Vietnam veteran. His wife's name is June. They have 2 children. Career Air Force officer, rank of major. He had talked to Bob Bazell earlier about the prospect that at some point one of these would blow up, and he said he wasn't sure that the country was prepared for that. Another member of the crew, Gregory Jarvis, 41-year-old payload specialist. That is, that he worked back in the payload bay on the various experiments and the satellite launches that they would be involved in. His wife's name is Marcia, 3 children. He's an engineer with Hughes Aircraft Company. He was bumped from the earlier December shuttle in favor of Congressman Bill Nelson, whom we heard from earlier today. And then, of course, our school teacher, and she did in a way belong to all of us, Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old. Her husband's name is Stephen. She has 2 children, as I indicated. She was going to conduct, in effect, classrooms in space. Her legacy was to be that she would be the first teacher to successfully complete a mission. It will not be that now. Ronald McNair, one of 4 black astronauts in the program. He's 45 years old. He has 2 children and a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T. He's a Ford Foundation fellow. He's a mission specialist. That means that he doesn't fly the spacecraft. He works on the various programs that are involved there. Ellison S. Onizuka, 39-year-old mission specialist. His wife's name is Lorna. They have 2 children. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and a Commendation Medal winner. And I'm unable to see our picture to tell you what we're showing you at this time. There's Judith Resnick. She is a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She's one of the women in the astronaut program, the 2nd woman to go into space. And of course, She was looking forward to a successful mission, and tragically, she too died. Michael Smith, a 40-year-old co-pilot. His wife Jane has 3 children. He's a Navy test pilot. He holds 5 military honors. A mix really of scientists, civilians, and military flyers who were brought together along with a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, on really a day that will live in our darkest memory, when all that goes wrong went wrong all at once in the space program. This space program from which we have expected only success and achievement, human achievement and technological achievement. Today, those expectations, those beliefs were just shattered for us in the skies over Florida.
The hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds,
monitored.
and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly.
As you can see,
3 engines running normally.
we're approaching the critical stage. They're going from 65% power to 104% power.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
They're at about 5 miles in space, 18 miles downrange.
Throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go throttle up.
The last words from Richard Scobie. Then the explosion.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical
The debris began to scatter across the sky.
Fred? 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 I must have monitors up here.
As I say, we have shown that to you repeatedly again and again and again today. It is not that we have a ghoulish curiosity. We just think that it's important that all members of the audience who are coming to their sets at different times of the day have an opportunity to see it. And of course, everyone is led to their own speculation based on what happened here today as well. We are now awaiting the arrival of President Reagan in the Oval Office, where he will directly address the nation on this tragedy. All schedules have been scrambled here in Washington, as I'm sure that they have been across the country today, as we try to deal with the enormity of this tragedy. What we have here is the President speaking to the nation today about this national tragedy, as it was described by Jess Moore, instead of addressing the country tonight on what he had hoped would be a message of hope and peace and a forward-looking future for America, talking about family values and the hope of the economy. That was the State of the Union address, which has now been, of course, postponed until next Tuesday, and the President will talk to us from the Oval Office. Chris Wallace will be standing by thereafter to talk about the investigation machinery that has already been put in place. The White House on a stark and somber day. The President was informed as he prepared for his State of the Union address tonight. It was his idea, as I indicated earlier, to put a teacher in space, and he felt, as he indicated to reporters when he met with them earlier at the Roosevelt Room, a great personal loss and sympathy, thinking especially of the husband and the children of Krista McAuliffe, who was lost today in that explosion. And now here is the President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers and overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
President Reagan with a moving statement, a personal statement really, from the White House, from the Oval Office today, explaining that he had hoped tonight to address the State of the Union in a joint session of Congress, but instead he was forced to share with the American public this national tragedy. He talked about these brave people who have slipped the surly bonds of earth and touched the face of God. And he addressed as well, quite directly it seemed to me, the school children of the country, many of whom were watching today because, after all, this was part of the effort to put a school teacher in space, was to reach out to this new generation of youngsters, to tell them about space, to excite them about the prospects of going to this new frontier. And the president talked, too, about Sir Francis Drake, who was an explorer of the same magnitude of an earlier time. Incidentally, it may be helpful to those of you who are parents that we had here earlier today a child psychiatrist who talked about how you might deal with the trauma that will set in a household, both among adults and children. And what he said to us was that you should encourage the children to talk about it and share with them your own grief and your own shock and your own emotional feeling. And he suggested as well, it's not a good time for confrontation, not a good time to tell them to stop watching television or to stop reading about it or to stop talking about it. He suggested, too, that it may be a good idea to ask them about the reaction of their pals, the other youngsters, boys and girls, and how they feel about it. In other words, get at it through the back door. But the important thing is, he said, is that as a family, to deal with all of this together, collectively, to show the children that you too feel for what has happened today, and that you know that life will go on, and that you'd like to share this very troubling experience with them. Chris Wallace at the White House tonight. Where do we go from here, Chris, in terms of what the president has in mind? He sent Vice President George Bush to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and we're told now that the Vice President will be returning this evening, right? He's going down there symbolically to represent the administration?
Well, I think that's right. There were 2 points, 2 charges that Vice President Bush had as he headed to the Kennedy Space Center, and those were, first of all, to talk to the families. A number of the families of the 7 members of the crew were there at the Cape, and the president wanted Vice President Bush to express his personal condolences on their loss. Secondly, to, in effect, give a presidential push to the investigation of the accident. It's going to be handled by NASA, but the president clearly wanted his vice president there to say that he is desperately interested in finding out exactly what happened.
Okay, Chris Wallace, we want to remind our local stations right here that you can cut away to return to your local programming, but that NBC News coverage of this national tragedy, as it has been so accurately described by NASA officials and by President Reagan, will continue. It will go on now, and we will have our regular schedule of NBC News programming, including NBC Nightly News tonight. But for now, local stations may cut away if they so choose. Chris Wallace, back at the White House. Can you tell us any more of the personal detail? You and I were both there today in the Roosevelt Room when it seemed to me that Don Regan was almost in a state of disbelief given the low-key way that he announced to us the shuttle has blown up. Details to follow. And as I went out into the corridors of the White House, I found people standing around out there looking as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing and being reported to them.
Well, that's right. I guess it's a classic case of what the psychologists call denial. What happened is, to recap briefly, is that Don Regan, the White House Chief of Staff, was holding a briefing for network anchors and for White House correspondents on the President's State of the Union address. We were in the Roosevelt Room across the hall from the Oval Office when one of Regan's aides came in with a small piece of paper, and Regan read it out loud as he read it himself for the first time. It said, "The shuttle has exploded, details to follow." You and the other anchors got up immediately, but in a sense, for most of the rest of us, there was almost a sense of disbelief. Regan, for a couple of minutes, started to go ahead with the briefing, and we kept taking notes. And then suddenly everybody realized that this news was so much bigger than a State of the Union address, and that everything had to be put on the back burner for a while.
And Nancy Reagan was watching in the private quarters of the White House.
That's right. What we are told is that, in fact, she was watching on live television, watching the launch, which has become obviously almost, it had seemed, a very routine matter when suddenly she saw the terrible accident. Her press aide quotes her as saying, I guess basically to herself as she watched the camera, "Oh my God, no." And then she said, according to her aide, that she immediately began to pray that there was at least some thread of hope that some person had survived that crash. Apparently now, of course, the hope is gone.
All right, Chris Wallace, we'll ask you to stand by there at the White House to bring us up to date on any additional details that we may have in investigations and on the future of the space program. The president, of course, has been very committed to the space program, and there is the other question that we can't answer tonight and may not be able to for some time, what effect all of this will have on his hopes for the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, more popularly known as Star Wars. The critics certainly will use this as an opportunity to say you cannot build a fail-safe defense in space if you have this kind of a problem with the Space Shuttle program. One of those on board today was Judy Resnick. She was 36 years old. She would have been 37 years old in April. She has a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She was the second female in space after Dr. Sally Ride, of course, made her famous ride into space as well now. Dr. Resnick flew on the shuttle mission SDS-41D, which was launched from the Kennedy Space Center on August 30th, 1984. I got to know her, however, at the beginning of the Space Shuttle program when she was one of the experts assigned to the NBC News team so she could be our commentator. And we had, all of us, a good time with Judy because she was a by-the-book astronaut, but she had a real mischievous side to her. She could not believe how informal television was, and we sometimes threw her curves by saying, no, we're not going to do that now, we're going to go over here, and she was able to ride along with us, as it were. In 1981, I had a talk with her about what she had hoped to get out of the space program and about her life in it. And here is some of that conversation now. Dr. Judy Resnick. For 20 years in this country, the word astronaut automatically meant a man, but that's changed. In fact, beginning in 1978, NASA began accepting the first women astronauts. There are now 8 out of the 81 members of the astronaut corps based in Houston. One of the first half dozen to be accepted is Judy Resnick, now 32 years old, a native of Akron, the holder of a doctorate in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She is single, she plays the piano, and she's a runner. She's not quite a pilot. I guess you fly in the back seat of the T-38s, right?
That's correct.
So you have certain aeronautical skills and so on.
Yes.
But when you're a little girl growing up in Akron, Ohio, did you say, gee, I'd like to be an astronaut someday?
No, I really didn't think about it until right about 4 years ago when NASA announced that they were looking for astronauts who would be engineers and scientists on the space shuttle, and it was accidental that I heard about it, and I just took a chance and applied.
Yeah. But once you got into the program, wasn't there a little bit of resentment or a little bit of male chauvinism that was demonstrated to you? This is a very male kind of fighter pilot world that you were entering.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I think everybody leaned over backwards to make sure that we were treated as equals right from the beginning.
Is there anything in the space program that women inherently do better than men?
Not that I can think of. We're smaller, but that's about the only thing.
But that hasn't changed anything?
No.
You had to change the uniform some, though. You did have a little talk with them about that.
Well, the only thing that they had to do was make a smaller size pressure suit. One size fits all, small size for men doesn't fit small women, so we now have an extra small.
Okay. We want to show some videotape of some of the physical training that you have to undergo at NASA. You can talk about that a little bit as we take a look at it now with Judy Resnick. It's a pretty tough program. Were you prepared for this, for the physical difficulty of it?
Well, it's not really so difficult physically. It's a lot of new things, but they lead you through it by the hand. This is a demonstration of
now, wait a minute. That doesn't look like a lot of fun for a Saturday afternoon to me. I don't know about you, but...
Well, you have to learn how to survive in case you have to get out of an airplane in a parachute, and they teach you step by step how to fall, how to be dragged. That's the impact you feel if you go through an ejection seat, and it's really not as bad as it looks. They show you how to fall into the water by, instead of letting you fall the first time, they let you slide down a slide wire. Like I say, they break you into it gradually.
Were you a tomboy when you were a kid?
No.
You weren't, and you took to this right away. You like it?
It's fun.
What's the best part about being an astronaut?
Everything.
You just like it all?
Yes.
You get to exercise your training, electrical engineering, and expand your knowledge enormously, I would think.
Yes, I think the best part technically is that it's a very well-rounded approach to science and technology, and we get to do a little bit of everything in state-of-the-art, and it's always a challenge.
What happens when you meet a man who's not in the space program and doesn't know who you are, and you say, I'm an astronaut? Does he say, yeah, you're too cute to be an astronaut. Come on, little lady, you can't be an astronaut?
I just tell him I'm an engineer.
You don't tell him you're an astronaut?
Not unless he asks.
You really, you mean when you meet people for the first time? What about the whole business about social relationships? Does it make it, are some men threatened by the fact that you're an astronaut?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably not my friends.
Yeah. Judy Resnick, she would have been 37 years old in April. She's a classically trained pianist from Akron, Ohio. She loved the space program more than I can describe for you here today, and really loved going up into space. I had an enthusiastic letter from her not too long ago. She was saying that she was hoping I could come down and watch this one because she was sure it was going to go off on schedule. We used to have a running dialogue about whether NASA could keep to its schedule or not. She was a absolutely wonderfully dedicated astronaut, and it's a great loss to her family and, of course, to the country as well. It just really is an example of the kind of people that you have in the astronaut program. They are so gifted in so many ways. A PhD in electrical engineering, she was an enthusiastic gardener, she was a classical pianist, and despite her protestations that she couldn't do things better than some of the men, all of the men told me that when she operated that big Canadian arm at the back of the payload, she had a great touch, that she had real dexterity. It may have been a result of her piano training, but at any rate, it is a great loss for everybody. We have now a schematic that we can show you that we will superimpose, as it were, over some of the pictures that we saw earlier today. These are the actual pictures, and then the schematic, as you can see, lays over so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Could we put that back up there again? Okay, fine. Anyhow, we're watching it now begin to blow up, and as you can see, the shuttle itself was on the bottom. The two solid rocket boosters were on either side, and the external tank is what appeared to come apart, although it's, I must emphasize that Jess Moore from NASA, who knows a great deal more about this than I do, refused to speculate based on those pictures. He's looked on them, he's looked at them, he's listened to all of us as we have made our observations today that it appeared to be a problem with the external tank, and he refused to get into that speculation, as well as he should not get into it, because after all, we want the best kind of investigation to go forward. Bob Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California right now. Bob, what are they saying out there about the nature of the investigation?
Well, the nature of the investigation isn't something that's being conducted here. This is the headquarters for unmanned spaceflight. However, one of the things that was interesting here is that so many of us who cover space regularly were here because of the Uranus mission of the Voyager spacecraft. And even the most veteran, hardened, experienced space reporter, there was just such a state of shock here among people who had seen so many space launches one after another to see what had happened today. When you're talking about the external fuel tank, and we're just speculating here as we have been all day long, obviously that was what exploded. The question is whether it was the first thing to explode and whether it was the thing that initiated the explosion, and I guess that's the key question, because when we do look at those pictures, there's no question that that huge barrel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, one of the most explosive combinations that human beings can put together, did go up and annihilate everything that had been left of the space shuttle. There's no question about that. The question is what initiated it. One of the things that will certainly be looked at in the investigation, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is what happened, but one of the things that will be examined in the investigation is that there are what NASA calls pyrotechnics. There are explosives on board the shuttle which are designed to blow it up. Now, there are hundreds of safety devices to keep those things from going off accidentally, but there is a man called the range safety officer whose duty it is to watch the shuttle, and in case it starts to go way off course and approach a populated area, he presses a button that would cause the shuttle to blow up. Now, those pyrotechnic devices are one of many, probably hundreds or even thousands of things that they're looking at as a possible malfunction. So, as Jess Moore said before, just from looking at that tape, all that you can see is that there was an explosion. You can't see what caused it, and it's probably going to take them an awful long time. One of the things that was interesting to me, having watched so many launches and looking at it, is that there wasn't a single indication of anything going wrong whatsoever. There was talk about the launch looking slow and everything, but if we've done earlier in the day, if you play it back next to normal launches, in fact, it wasn't slow. It has to do with camera angles. There was talks about funny noise, but that has to do with the wind condition. It was a cold day, so that it would have sounded much different to anybody who was there than it would on a normal Florida humid afternoon. There was nothing, no indication whatsoever, because if there had been, they would have radioed it to the crew. There would have been some evidence of it in the conversation. The only thing there was the permission for Dick Scobie, the commander, to go ahead to full throttle, his acknowledgement of that command, and then apparently as he just was going to full throttle, there was the explosion. So it's going to take quite an investigation to find out. At this point, there are no clues whatsoever. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who, as he indicated, he's watched a good many of those, and they are magnificent sights on takeoff, as they were today, as a matter of fact. In the original flight, I remember a man saying it's a real pant flapper. You have no sense of what it's like on takeoff, the sheer raw power of the space shuttle and its attached propellant systems, until you're there and can feel it, as you actually can, as it sweeps across the Cape, the sound and the reverberations on takeoff, and it's a sight of utter majesty. And then today, that sight of utter majesty turned into a sight of utter horror. John Palmer's in New York now with additional information on this national tragedy, which has been going on now for almost 6 hours. John Palmer.
Yes, Tom, a national tragedy it is, a very sad day, and another sad statistic. A total of 11 children now have apparently lost at least one of their parents as the result of the explosion and the downing of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a catastrophic fire that blew apart the Space Shuttle just about a minute and a half after it took off. A few minutes ago, the Associate Director of NASA and the head of the Houston Space Center, in that very brief announcement and took a few questions down at the Cape, he said that the space program, had experienced a national tragedy and he said there was no evidence the crew had survived. It's now after sundown in that search area, about 18 miles off the coast from Cape Canaveral, and as Jess Moore told us about 45 minutes ago, they have found no evidence, no debris, and certainly no sign of any survivors whatsoever. Jess Moore announced that he has formed an interim board to investigate, to review the facts right immediately, and to impound all information, all computer data, to get ready for another more formal board that will really look into the cause to see what happened. He said he would not speculate on the cause of the explosion because he said it was just too early, and as Tom just mentioned, he said that he was not going to speculate on the basis of those tragic pictures we see of about a minute and a half into the flight, the explosion there of the space shuttle. Again, he said there were no reports of any debris recovered. He was asked if there was any pressure whatsoever to get this particular shuttle off the ground. It had been delayed several days. It was delayed again today a couple of hours because of the freezing temperatures there and because of some icicles. Its predecessor, the Columbia, had been delayed for 7 days. They had planned 15 different space shuttles throughout this year of 1986. Obviously, they're not going to make that schedule, and there was even some doubt because of the delays of the last 2 shuttles that they were going to be able to make it. Moore said that all he could say is, obviously, from his observation and from ours and from everyone's, there was an explosion. He said, for now, the space program is suspended. He said there were no unusual weather conditions whatsoever. He said they sent up the usual airplanes early in the morning. They sent up weather balloons. It has been noted, though, that the jet stream was unusually far to the south in the last 24 hours, moving down over central Florida at about an altitude of 7 to 9 miles. The speed of the jet stream of the winds there clocked at about 100 miles an hour this morning. It was well below freezing. That doesn't mean that this perhaps had anything whatsoever to do with the tragedy that occurred, but it was a low of 25 for several hours overnight at Cape Canaveral. And that came up at about 10 o'clock in the morning to about 32 degrees, and the launch went off at 11:38 Eastern Time, the explosion following about a minute and a half later. There will be, of course, no State of the Union address tonight. The President, addressing the nation a short while ago from the Oval Office, stated, of course, that he wanted to come and talk about the state of the nation, but because of the tragedy, he said he was pained to the core, he and Mrs. Reagan pained to the core, that this was a day of national mourning. He said of the astronauts, they had a hunger to explore the universe. And, of course, he had those comments, those very poignant, very sad comments to the school children. Literally thousands of school kids all across this country were waiting in their classrooms to see this liftoff because the teacher, Christy McAuliffe, was taking off and was going to give exactly 2, I think it was, lessons from outer space. That's the situation now, kind of a wrap-up to the point. Again, it's after dark, and we couldn't expect really many more developments out of that search area. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
Thank you very much, John Palmer. All manner of little tidbits of information coming our way. Governor Bob Graham, the governor of Florida, who has witnessed a number of those shuttle launches, was on a campaign tour today announcing his candidacy for the Senate, and he saw the takeoff and then the explosion from his airplane as he was flying over Florida. And about the president's message to the school children of America, it's very easy for those of us who are grown-ups to be kind of jaded about the space program. I recall vividly a friend of mine, a grown-up, who was watching a launch of a shuttle and turned to his wife and said, "Oh, it's another boring space launch." When his son, who was about 12 years old at the time, turned to him and said, "Hey, that's my future that you're talking about." And that's what the administration obviously had hoped would be an important part of this mission, that the youngsters of this country would think about that as their future. And nowhere was there more attention being paid to this shuttle launch today than in Concord, New Hampshire, the home of Christy McAuliffe. She was a school teacher there of 3rd graders, but these were high school kids watching from an auditorium. The unalloyed joy of high school students with a kind of unofficial holiday as they watched what appeared to be the successful takeoff of the Challenger with Christy McAuliffe on board. And then the realization that something terrible was wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time? We're asking all students to leave.
The best and worst, of course, of live television coverage coming together there in that auditorium as we were all able to watch what happened to what turned out to be their friend and then 6 other people that we cared about as a nation, the astronauts, as the shuttle blew up. And we were all suspended for a time between a state of belief and disbelief, not quite sure what we were seeing could in fact happen, because we have come to expect so much from high technology. But then the slow realization that in fact that our worst fears now were being realized. I will tell you that as a journalist who's covered the space program for a long time, that's been at the back of the mind of a lot of us. Maybe one of these will blow up on the pad or blow up in the sky someday and we have to watch it, but we always kind of put it at the back of our mind, never quite believing that it would happen. The astronauts who were involved in today's flight were interviewed before they went off about their feelings and their thoughts. Most of them, of course, not expressing fears because they're not built that way, frankly. Here's what some of them had to say about what lay ahead, they thought.
Dr. McNair, first of all, this is your second flight. Can you give us any perspective on what it's been like for you training this time as opposed to last time, or your sense of anticipation this time as opposed to last time?
Well, starting with my sense of anticipation, I would say it's greater this time than the first, simply because I know how great it is, how nice it is, and how much fun it is, and how fascinating the entire experience is. Training the second time around, I would have to say, is a little easier. A lot of it you've done already. It's a matter of refreshing. I do have some new payloads that I have to start at ground zero with and learn, but having done it really has its advantages. But I do look forward to this, and it's as challenging. One cannot get laxed about it, approach it with the same amount of caution as the first or any time, but overall it's not as taxing.
Well, Mr. Jarvis, you are finally going to get to go up. It must, in addition to the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of things for your company, you must be, as an individual, be fairly charged up at this point.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
Well, what do you look forward to after this, Colonel? You've got a couple of you'll have a couple of flights under your belt after you get back from this one. What's your goal after that?
Well, I hope to stay with the space program. Certainly fly more missions. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I expect to stay with the program. Looking forward, like I said, to more missions and some involvement to future programs downstream. So I enjoy the space program. I'm very intrigued by the challenge it offers, and I look forward to staying with it as long as I can.
Is it possible for you to describe the way you describe your anticipation of the mission at this point? You must be excited as well as ready, I would suppose.
Well, I am excited, and I guess I look at it like I look at flying new airplanes along back in my career. You know, you prepare as much as you can for it, and knowing that the real thing is going to probably be somewhat different than what the simulator is. But I think what I'm really looking forward to is just the experience of doing the ascent and seeing all the things that everyone comes back and talks about that they see while they're on orbit, watching the crew work together. You know, we've worked a long time now, 9 months or so, putting this whole flight together and watching everything happen, hopefully close to the way we've planned it. And I'm sure there'll be some problems to take care of along the way, which will be a challenge, and be able to come back and say I've done it, and hopefully go do it again quite a few times.
Both Chris McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis fit very well in the crew, and the things that they're doing, I think, are assets to the space program. And if they're assets to the space program and they're getting people interested in space and getting them to expect to fly in space, and space is in their future, then I think it's good for the country to do that. And if it's good for the country, then they ought to be flying. The people that fly that are good for the country and good for science ought to be there.
Dick Scobie, the Air Force major who was the commander of the space shuttle flight, the last words that we heard from him, of course, were go for full throttle. He's a retired major in the U.S. Air Force, 46 years old. He would have been 47 years old on May 19th, and other members of that astronaut crew, in addition to Krista McAuliffe. We want to remind our stations once again that we will have continuous coverage here on NBC NBC News will provide continuous coverage of this national tragedy throughout the early evening, and then there will be a special report tonight at 10 Eastern Time as well. But for those of you who want to return now to your local programming, you may feel free to do so, as I'm sure that you will. We want to show you now some of the news conference that occurred earlier today at Cape Kennedy, actually late this afternoon Eastern Time. Jess Moore, who was the NASA official in charge at the Cape at the time of the launch, and then the disaster, the gigantic fireball that appeared to have blown up the Space Shuttle Challenger about 1.5 minutes into its flight. He met with reporters today. He didn't have much to say in terms of shedding new light on what was learned, but he did say and outline for the reporters assembled there what the procedures will be now for the investigation. Let's listen to some of that news conference.
Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce the Associate Administrator of Spaceflight from NASA headquarters, Jess Moore.
It is with deep, heartfelt sorrow that I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, the space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately 1.5 minutes after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, Pilot Michael J. Smith, Mission Specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay.
That was Herb Ross, who is the administrator of the space program at Cape Kennedy, at Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, talking about the fact that he has impounded all of the notes and all of the tapes, and he will not engage in any needless speculation about what may have gone wrong until they have a very thorough investigation. He did say, of course, that there were no survivors among the astronauts so far as they could tell. It has now been just about 6 hours precisely since there was that unexpected explosion in space, and as we saw, the Space Shuttle Challenger was consumed by a great fireball, and we believe now that all 7 people on board were killed. One of those that has been getting so much attention today, understandably, is Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old teacher from Concord, Massachusetts, from Concord, New Hampshire, the mother of 2 children, and her husband, who was there today watching this launch along with her parents. Krista McAuliffe was a graduate of Framingham State College in Massachusetts, which is just below New Hampshire, of course. And at Framingham College, they were very proud of what she was going to do as a graduate of that school. And this evening, they held a memorial service there. And we're going to show you some pictures of that now, if we can.
We thank you, Lord, for the gift of Krista, who is so special to the Framingham State College community and to so many others who know and love her greatly. We pray that nothing of her life will ever be lost, and that in spite of this tragedy, all those things which Krista holds to be important will be respected and continued by us who were touched in some way by her life, by her quest, by her spirit.
Krista McAuliffe lost today in the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which she had hoped would be, of course, a week of triumph for her. Turns out to be the end of her life and a national tragedy. President Reagan spoke about this about 40 minutes ago now when he addressed the nation from the Oval Office, talking in a brief but eloquent statement about what this means to all of us. The President of the United States once again.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them, your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
That was President Reagan speaking to the nation from the Oval Office today. I want to correct something that I left a wrong impression about earlier. The Concord High School is where Krista McAuliffe taught. The third graders who were assembled today at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral were members of the third grade class of her son, Scott. They were there with him, which makes it all the more tragic, of course, that they had to share that horrible moment as they were all there assembled looking on, as I said earlier, in a suspended state of disbelief and belief, not quite knowing what they were seeing, and then learning from NASA officials that, in fact, there had been, in the words of one NASA announcer, a major malfunction, which was the understatement of the day, if not the year, obviously. They did have the explosion. So those were third graders who were friends of her son, Scott, who were there with him, along with her parents, of course, and her husband, as well as her daughter. Robert Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Bob?
Tom, here at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is another NASA facility, there's a notice on the board here that in a few minutes Vice President Bush will be briefing the press from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, so I'm sure we'll be wanting to go live to that. Other than that, we might recap a few things we've been saying all day long for those of us who are just joining us, which is that those of us who have watched many launches have no clue. Neither do any engineers we've talked to about what went wrong. We only see that there was an explosion, a terrible, fierce, quick explosion which engulfed the entire spacecraft. It looks like the 7 people on board, knew very little of what happened. They probably had no notice whatsoever. They knew nothing was coming, and I think the only good news we can say is that they apparently suffered no pain whatsoever. So we have only that to go on. The investigation is just beginning. It's going to go on for a long time. To repeat what Jess Moore said during his press conference, who's the director of the shuttle program, there was a...
he's about to speak.
There was no notice they've impounded all the notes of all the engineers. They've impounded all the data that came down from the spacecraft, what's called the telemetry. All that will be examined in great detail. They'll undergo something called failure analysis, where we'll try on a scale model to repeat the accident to try to understand what happened. But as of right now, we have no idea whatsoever. There was no indication of anything awry. The space shuttle took off on a cold, which may have been part of the problem, beautiful Florida morning, into a clear sky, and suddenly it just exploded. Nothing like this has ever happened in the U.S. space program. As we pointed out before, 3 people were killed 19 years and a day ago, but they were in a practice session on a launch pad, and it had nothing to do with the explosive power of the launch. And in fact, that's one of the things that people continue to point out today, is that America has sent so many people into space before without a single injury, let alone a death, in the air up to now, and this is the first time. A terrible, terrible tragedy, and as yet we certainly have no clue as to what happened. We're standing by now for Vice President Bush, who will be speaking to us pretty soon from Florida, where he arrived today. He was flown down on President Reagan's orders very quickly from Washington to see the families of the 7 crew members, many of whom were gathered there. It's a tradition at the Kennedy Space Center for most of the astronauts to bring their families. They go up to the roof of the huge building near the launch pad, the vehicle assembly building, and when we in the press area watch the launch, usually we see all the family members, all of them together. They go up to watch their family take off, and what a terrible, terrible sight that must have been today. And as these people realize that their worst fears, which of course they always harbored, anybody who thought about the space program always realized, as you said before, that this was a possibility. But we never thought we would see it as a reality, and so quickly and with no warning whatsoever. Tom?
Thank you very much, Robert Bazell. We have just now received word that President Reagan has officially ordered all flags in the country to be flown at half-staff. The flag at the Kennedy Space Center, as we showed you earlier, has already been situated at half-staff until next Monday, or rather through next Monday. Naval vessels will be flying theirs at half-mast. That's the appropriate phrase that should be used. Half-staff for those on ground, half-mast for those at sea. And of course, as we receive any words of additional memorial services along the way, we'll let you know that as well. That's where we stand at this time. We do expect Vice President Bush to make his statement when he arrives at the Kennedy Space Center, and we expect that to happen momentarily. Shall we just show you one more time the space model for those of you who have been joining us along the way? This is it. You'll be seeing it a lot more on videotape, of course, during the day. This is the big aircraft, the external tank, and it appears that came apart at the time of the explosion. These are the 2 solid rocket boosters. I'm going to show you all that now. Here's the configuration. Let me see if I can get this right. You're going to see it the same way you're going to see it in your television screen. It was going in about this direction, which we're about to show you now. This is the external tank. You'll see these 2 solid rocket boosters that are on either side, and then you'll see this beneath it. We're going to show you simultaneous tapes now of 2 launches, one earlier this year, January 12th, and then the one today that tragically blew up. But this is the configuration, so you'll know what's going on. Today in January 12th.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
We'll get back to that in a moment. We want to go now to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where Vice President George Bush is speaking.
The crew. The President and I and the entire nation join in mourning the 7 splendid men and women who now rest in God's arms. Today's tragedy reminds us that danger awaits all who push back the frontier of space. It reminds us that the great adventure of space travel requires men and women of spirit and bravery. I'd like to say something in particular, something special to the school children of our nation, and especially those from Concord. You must try to understand that spirit, bravery, and commitment are what make not only the space program, but all of life worthwhile. We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on. What can all of us give now to honor those we've lost? Let me suggest a memorial to them. We must be as they were, great in spirit, great in courage, and great in dedication to the adventure of which they were so much a part. We must resolve that, like America's pioneers of the past, others will follow, others explore, others will risk, as these 7 brave Americans risk today. And so I came here today to
check 1, 2.
pay our sincere condolences to the families and friends of the 7.
Hello?
And also to the proud men and women of NASA. We salute them in this hour of trial. Thank you very much, and I'm now going to go and pay my respects to the families. I'm sure that Senator Glenn and Senator Garn might like to add something, but I might excuse myself and come over here if I could.
I would only add very briefly that I'm pleased to be here with the Vice President. Our only purpose in coming was to pay tribute to the crew. It's been a very difficult day for me personally because I knew each of them. I trained with some of them, and I just extend my love and condolences to their families.
Let me add just a word. I'm very appreciative that the Vice President would ask us to accompany him today here, even though it is a very sad occasion. It's been nearly a quarter of a century that we've thought this might happen sometime, but we've delayed that day until today. We hoped that this day would never come, but unfortunately it has, and with a tragedy that all Americans share together. I share a sense of personal loss, having been involved in the program, as Jake just mentioned, he does too. But remember, yesterday was an anniversary also when Gus Grissom and Roger Chafee and Ed White very tragically lost their lives in the fire on the pad here. But since that time, you know, we've had 56 manned missions so far, 24 with the shuttle. And I guess what it points out more than anything else is that while we have many triumphs, that's the nature of all human progress, is we try, keep trying the new, trying to better ourselves and trying to learn more. While we have triumphs, many of them, once in a while, there's a tragedy. And it's that triumph and tragedy comparison that we have here today. As one of the people who's been here all day with some of the families that told us coming in a few moments ago when he was talking to the families earlier, several of them said to him, "Don't let this slow the program down." And they gave lives of their families or their loved ones or their friends in this effort. So I guess we could say that these 7 that went up this morning carried the hopes and the dreams of all of us. And what we can do now is make sure that we carry their memories in carrying on. Thank you.
Glenn and Senator Jake Garn, each of them veterans of the space program. Senator Glenn, of course, an authentic member of the so-called Right Stuff group, the original group of astronauts. Senator Garn, a veteran pilot who was selected by NASA to ride in one of the missions last year. He's a key member of a Senate committee that has a lot to do with the funding of NASA. There was a fair amount of cynical observation at that time that it was just an assurance on the part of NASA trying to buy some insurance that their funding wouldn't go on, but he obviously was dedicated to the program, and he talked today about these people who were his friends, including one member he called his mother hen, and that would have been the pilot, Mr. Smith, who was one of the astronauts who was killed there today. Vice President Bush will be meeting with members of the family. It's traditional to have a kind of family celebration on these occasions. Friends are invited as well because it's a special time in your life. If you're an astronaut or a friend or a family member of an astronaut, you can go down there and watch them go into space. And there's a festive carnival-like environment. And then today to look on as I say, with that great feeling of exhilaration. Everything seemed to be going so splendidly. And then to have it turn so instantly into such a nightmare in the sky, in those beautiful blue Florida skies, with those white contrails suddenly raining debris down on the Atlantic Ocean. We can talk on and on about this, but I suspect that as this day goes on, we're each dealing with it in our own personal fashion. That words simply are inadequate, even the best words of the President and the Vice President and the other people who have commented on this tragedy here today, including this commentator and this reporter and other members of NBC News. A fund, by the way, is being set up in Washington, D.C. for the children of the astronauts. It's being set up at the American Security Bank in Washington, D.C. There were 9 children, I believe, who lost mothers or fathers today as a result of this tragedy. We have George Lewis now on the people who built the shuttle itself. George Lewis.
All of the shuttles have been put together at the Rockwell Aerospace plants in Southern California. When these pictures were taken in May of 1981, work was underway on the assembly of the shuttle Challenger. Today at the plant, the atmosphere was somber. The people who work here feel personally responsible for the safety of the astronauts who ride aboard the shuttles. George Anderson is a supervisor for hydraulic systems on the shuttle program.
Obviously, we're upset by it all. That's about all I can say about it right at the moment.
Terry Schaefer, an engineer.
I was very shocked and amazed. I just heard the news, and it's incredible. It's totally incredible to me that anything like this could happen, especially with the checks and balances that they have built into the system.
Engineer William Roberts offered some speculation as to what may have gone wrong.
We had a catastrophic failure of the tank. That's from what I've been viewing of the television films. And when you have that happen, the two liquids, the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen, they become quite an explosive mixture. You could have had the common bulkhead that's between the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. You could have had an extreme pressure differential, and the common bulkhead could have failed. And if that fails, you have exactly what you see here.
Many of the people at this plant watched the live coverage as the Challenger exploded. Most are still in a state of shock as they turn to the task of trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to figure out what will have to be done to prevent it from happening again. George Lewis, NBC News, Los Angeles.
And Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who was flying that, talked recently about safety. I want to correct one thing, by the way. I said I thought that 9 children had lost either a mother or fathers in the course of today's tragedy. It turns out that 11 altogether children now have lost a parent as a result of what happened today. And the fund has been set up at the American Security Bank in Washington, D.C. Only Krista McAuliffe, so far as we know, was insured based on one report that we saw earlier, especially for this flight. A $1 million policy had been taken out by a space firm which donated it to her here in Washington, D.C. She did talk recently about the safety factor, Krista McAuliffe, and whether she worried about her own personal safety in this flight.
And it lost one engine, and they were talking about a real severe problem. All of a sudden, boing, you all of a sudden realize that, hey, things can go wrong with that thing.
Oh, sure.
It is space flight. It's, umpteen quadrillion pounds of thrust behind you there. Does that give you any pause to think? Or?
Not really, because they could have landed in Dakar, they could have landed in Spain. I mean, they do have the ability to have contingencies. There are plans in case there's a problem. And also the thought that, I think I'm going to be up on Challenger's 10th mission. And that just to think that the shuttle has gone, 10 times. That's an exciting thing. And no, I think it's a very safe program.
How did you decide to do, without going into the specifics of the particular lessons, because we'll have that, how did you decide to do the lessons as they are now planned?
Well, when the 10 of us met in Washington and determined that we wanted something that was very flight specific, we wanted something that couldn't be done anyplace else or would not have the impact unless it was done on the shuttle, we chose 3 lessons. And there were 3 categories that we came up with. And the last one, the Earth observation, which we were very excited about, after talking to the astronauts and talking to people here, we realized that there was a possibility that I would be monitoring 15 minutes of cloud cover out the window. So we had to revise that. That's still going to be done, but it's going to be done using a film that's brought back from the 51L mission.
I see.
Krista McAuliffe, all the obvious qualities are there. The irony, of course, is that she talked about this being the 10th mission of the Challenger, which it was, and she felt that it was a safe program, and if something really went wrong, that they could make the emergency landing, either in Senegal or in Spain, or go once around and land back at the Cape again. They never had that opportunity today. They were engulfed by that giant fireball, and all apparently were killed. That's the word now from NASA officials today. No sign of any survivors whatsoever. John Palmer will continue the NBC News coverage of this national tragedy. I'm preparing now for NBC Nightly News, which will come on in most areas, I would guess, at its regularly scheduled time. For those stations who want to cut away now to their local programming, they should feel free to do so. We'll continue our coverage from New York with John Palmer in just a moment.
Thank you. Tragedy happens. There is really no hope.
Put a finger, tear into them, just take a bite, get the taste that feels so right, baby Ruth. Put a finger, tear into them, which do you choose? Both so great, you just can't.
Chewy, nutty Baby Ruth, crispy, crunchy, peanut buttery Butterfinger with their great rich taste.
Tear into them now, Nabisco.
In a perfect world, every stain would be seen and reported. But in the real world, most stains go unreported, right through the wash and into your dryer, where they could be set for life. But add Biz Bleach to your detergent, and you have a strong second line of defense to catch many unreported stains and remove them before it's too late. In an imperfect world, pin your hopes on this. Unreported stains can't get by Biz.
Mike Lozano, leading the way on News Center 13.
We now join our regularly scheduled program, already in progress.
Did you pay any additional money?
Yes, I did.
How much?
$159 plus the 20% interest rate of my master charge.
are the defendants, Lee and Catherine Ruman. They say not only was the plaintiff supposed to give them 150 photographs, but his excuse for shortchanging them was that their wedding was bland, and they're not about to pay the rude photographer more than he deserves. They're accused of failing to pay a photographer. We'll return for the case of Are 99 Pictures Enough? After these messages.
I'm about to turn the world of hand lotions upside down. This is the best-selling lotion. Thin and runny. Compared to this, Wondra. Watch this. Wondra is rich and creamy, full of the good stuff to help hands get softer and smoother. A clinical test against the bestseller proved Wondra works better. So, the choice is in your hands. But I'll take a lotion that's rich and creamy over one that's thin and runny, hands down. For softer, smoother skin, rich and creamy Wondra wins, hands down.
Here at the Silas Thorndike Academy, our boys display exemplary behavior. Occasionally, we do have an outbreak of high-spiritedness. When these little mishaps occur, we rely on Brawny. It's new. Brawny! It's the largest towel you can buy. And it's strong enough to handle even the toughest jobs. Thanks ever so much, Brawny.
Anytime, Teach. New Brawny, the big tough towel.
Want a lifesaver, honey?
Yeah, I'll have the red one.
There's only one red one left. Take the green one.
Oh, but I really love red cherry lifesavers. I had my heart set on the red one. And I asked for it first.
Look at you, a mature adult acting childish over a little piece of candy.
You bet your lifesavers. You can have the green one.
I like the green one better anyway.
Why? Is it better than the red?
Lifesavers rolled candy, and even the red one has less than 10 calories.
Nabisco.
In all my years as a practicing professional meteorologist here in Des Moines, I've never been so excited about the advances that we make daily in predicting almost unpredictable weather. New Center 13's Doppler storm scan radar is a leading breakthrough in tracking severe weather, letting us give you the earliest and most dependable weather picture. The best tools and the experience to use them. It's about the best investment New Center 13 can make for you.
This is the case of Are 99 Pictures Enough? Now, according to the plaintiff, he never promised the defendants a definite number of pictures, and he did make them an album of 99 photographs. He states, bottom line, he fulfilled his part of the contract, and now he wants them to do the same. As far as the defendants are concerned, the plaintiff promised them approximately 150 photographs, and they say 99 is not even close. They say they got only 2/3 of the photographic package and a lot of insults, so they are not about to pay him in full. So the question here is just what, if anything, do the defendants owe the plaintiff? Well, let's find out now as this case gets underway.
I know you've been sworn. I have read your complaint, sir. You performed some photographic services for the defendant?
Yes, I did.
Was there a written contract?
Of course.
Of course? Okay, let me see it. We don't always have written contract. Okay. Total price was to be $500?
$535 plus tax.
Oh, the service charge, all right.
That's a travel fee.
Approximately 150 pictures, 5x5s?
Correct.
All right, how many pictures did you do for them?
We presented them with 99 5x5s.
Why didn't you do 150?
Well, we were contracted to go to 4 different locations with the defendant, to start off at a friend's home shooting the bride and her maids of honor, go to the church and do some pictures there, and because the church would not allow formal group pictures, the bride and groom, to be posed together, we were to go to a 3rd location, pose family groups, bride and groom together, do some romantics, and then when we were all completed there, go to the 4th location, which was the reception. At the 3rd location, the defendant, while I was in the middle of posing groups, said to me, "Excuse me, I'm in a hurry to get to my reception. I don't want any more pictures taken." I said, "You're the boss, you're paying me, no problem, go."
Did he tell you that he didn't want you at the reception?
No, I went to the reception, shot more pictures there. I did group pictures there, candids of people.
Well, are you telling me you couldn't do 150 because you stopped shooting at the 3rd location?
I'm not telling you that at all. I'm saying that in the middle of shooting pictures...
I asked you, sir, why you didn't do 150, and you said...
I was prevented from. They had the smallest wedding I've ever attended. There were a maximum of 40 guests, no dancing,
Your Honor, excuse
no
me.
tables.
There were at least 70 guests at the wedding.
That's not true.
Well,
Did you count them?
Yes, I did.
I believe we know how many guests were at our wedding.
Did you send out?
Count the overall?
Yes, we
There's an
send out
overall.
invitations, and we have a whole list of the guests. And
There were 70 guests?
yes, and interestingly enough, the
No way.
66 of the pictures that he took were posed pictures before the reception. He only took 33 pictures at the reception, which went on for 3 or 4 hours. And I don't understand why we... Yes, we have the pictures.
Is that the book he gave
That
you?
is the
Yes,
album which
this
he
is-
claims
this is
is
the proofs.
we consider them proofs, absolutely.
That's
Is this a
not
finished
true.
product?
No, it's not. Those
What's-
are the 5x5 originals that they were to receive in a workbook. From those, they were to pick the ones that they wanted to go in an album, some or all. It didn't really matter to me.
You've
They
never
were to
done an album for them?
Of course, I can show you the type of album they were supposed to get.
I said, have you ever done an album for them?
No, I have not. They didn't allow me to complete it. I kept asking them to bring it back in so I could
He's
complete their
insisting that we
job.
should have those pictures that are pasted, physically glued into a paper album, placed in our final wedding album in a leather binder,
Are
when the
these-
contract definitely states
are these
150.
No, they're not.
What are they?
They're 5x5 original pictures.
Judge, I would like you to look at some of the pictures in there.
Picture number 28 through 32.
There are numbers written across the pictures, so I wouldn't consider that a professional photography job in
that
terms of it
number?
being any more than
32?
proof.
Picture number 28 through 32 are all basically the same, taken a long distance away from the church. They're the only pictures of the actual ceremony itself. And there are white vertical numbers running up and down just to left of center. There are 5 prints like that. All the prints are very identical.
How much, they did pay you $250?
They deposited $250 with me to hold the date for their job. I shot the job. They came into the studio, looked at their pictures, signed for them, and paid for
Excuse
them.
me, we did not look at the pictures in the studio. He kind of hurried
They
us out
did
because
look.
he was
That's
going
not
on a
true at all.
They're going on a
camping
camping
trip.
trip.
And so we looked at them when we got home, or we would have noticed earlier
They
that there were
signed
only
for 99 pictures with that date that
When
they
did
came
they-
in.
On this?
On my receipt right here, when they came into the
May I
studio,
see
they
it?
signed for it. Right here.
What are you here to tell me, sir?
I'm an assistant.
Were
for
you
Mr.
there?
Fields. Yes, I was.
What are you here to testify about?
I'm here to testify that the defendants rushed us at the 3rd location. We were now allowed the capability to take the kind...
How long were you there?
At the 3rd location,
Yes.
sir? No more than 20 minutes before the defendants had us rush off.
See, we would usually be doing...
to the
Well, how
reception.
many hours were you at the reception?
I'd say less than a few at most.
I'm at a loss to understand why you still couldn't shoot 150 pictures if
We
you...
don't go through the pictures and count them as we shoot them individually. We just do rolls of film. I posed them with friends that were there. I shot almost all the guests that were there. There were no tables. There was no dancing. There was no band. That constitutes a lot of pictures when
He
you
also
shoot
told us
a
that we were
wedding.
poor subject matter, Your Honor.
That's not true.
Yes, he did. That's a quote.
Well, you're complaining that they didn't have a band. Did you have a band?
No, we didn't. We had
I
a
didn't
garden
complain that they had a
reception with
band.
champagne and hors d'oeuvres. And there was plenty of room and plenty of time to
I also
shoot
never
pictures.
told them I would shoot 150 pictures.
It's in the
What does
contract.
approximately 150 mean, sir?
It means that approximately 150 pictures would be taken on an average job, just like I told
It
them.
says
I
set
said
of originals that you'd give them 150.
it says approximately.
Well, it says set of originals approximately 150.
Right, which is what they have at this time as the
It doesn't
set
say you
original.
just shoot 150 and they pick what they like. It says you're going to give them a set of originals approximately 150.
That's exactly what they have.
99 is 150?
They have approximately
My
150.
point is, I was willing to shoot more pictures. I asked them if they wanted more pictures. They said, no, you've just about covered it. I said, fine,
At the
I'm
third
done.
location.
At the 3rd location?
That was the
What does
third
that have to do
location. You
anything?
went back to the 4th one, didn't you?
You had
Right.
another 3 or 4 hours
Right.
to take pictures.
All right, we'll take a short recess. I'll come back and give you my decision.
Last year, Rent-A-Center introduced the best customer guarantees in the rent-to-own industry. You